All right. Thank you. So this is a meeting of the Licensing Committee of the California Board of Psychology. We're going to call the meeting to order and calling roll for us. Okay. Could you call roll? Thanks.
Okay. Horn,
Here.
Phillips, Fu.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a quorum here. Dr. Phillips will be late. So let's go ahead and start. First item on the agenda, which is any public comments for items not on the agenda. We won't take these items up today, but if there's something that you might like us to place on a future agenda, please let us know. So I'm going to open that up right now for any public comments about items not on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll move to approval of the Licensing Committee meeting minutes from October 13th, 2017. So are there any additions or corrections to those minutes?
No corrections here.
Okay, well, I have a couple and they're just grammatical, and I'll send those back to you, but I would like to draw our attention to line number 94 through lines number 94 through 96. We're talking about test questions. I think what I said, not that every test question referenced the ethics code, but that every test question had a reference. And that would prevent any question and its correct answer from being in conflict, basically. Not because it's law and ethics, so every question has a reference for something that we're being questioned on. Get that? So just say, okay, who's taking minutes, by the way? Okay, thanks. And I had another comment too. Oh, well, that's just a grammatical one. Sorry, it's just taken me a while to go through these. Just for the public to let you know, we are now getting our board materials online. And so we are reading from a computer, and I'm just going through the pages right now. So that's what's happening. So at this point, I think that might be it. Let me just, yeah, that's it. Just some grammatical stuff. So Dr. Phillips just arrived. Welcome.
I did. My apologies for being late.
And what we're doing is going through the minutes, if there were any additions or corrections to the minutes. Okay, so do you want to make a motion that we...
Dr. Phillips, I did.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I just remembered that I did have one.
All right.
That may be something you covered already, so my apologies.
You want to take a second?
Yeah, if you would. That'd be great.
We're going to take just about a 5-minute break because Dr. Phillips just arrived and he's going to get organized and get his stuff out. And Dr. Phillips, you have some additions or corrections to the minutes?
Yeah, there were a couple of things in the minutes that confused me. So I'm not sure they really represent what we intended to say. At line 339, there's a discussion about the committee suggested combining sections 2909 and 2910. That sentence in
339?
at line 339. Oh, have you guys already discussed this?
No.
Okay. But then if you go down to line 345 to 347, it says Renee Pilati, Executive Director of KPIC, agreed that it was important to look at why Section 2910 was added and was followed by adding Section 2909. Now, the way I read that, it doesn't make sense to me, but perhaps they were saying that was 2909 added subsequent to 29? Subsequent to 2910?
Section 2909 was effective 1981, and that was amended in 2016. And then 2910 was added in 1967 and was last amended in 2016.
So are you saying the way his comment was
Like it doesn't
selected doesn't?
kind of get at that. So,
I think basically he was just agreeing with what we said we were going to do.
so perhaps we could say something to that
Yeah,
effect instead.
agreed to that, because that's my recollection of, just to say, public comment that he agreed that it was important to look at these sections.
That's great. That was the only comment I had on the minutes.
All right, now, we've had our corrections or additions to the minutes. Is there a motion to accept the minutes as corrected?
Move with amendments?
Second.
So it has been moved and seconded to accept the minutes as amended or corrected. Could we have the roll call on that?
Sure. Fu,
Aye.
Horn,
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Motion is passed.
Thank you. Before I go on to the next part of the agenda, I had meant to do this earlier. I'd like us to start our committee meetings, the licensing committee meetings from now on, similarly to how we start our board meetings. And in this case, our board meetings start by reading the purpose of the mission of the board, and I'd like to start just by reminding people what the goal of the licensing committee is, or the goals are. The goal of this committee is to ensure valid licensing, continuing education, and licensure renewal policies and procedures, making recommendations for changes as appropriate. The committee will also ensure a valid and reliable examination process to assess professional knowledge, as well as the laws and ethics governing the profession, working with such entities as the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards and the Department of Consumer Affairs Office of Professional Examination Services. Those are the goals of and purpose of the licensing committee. So now, moving on from that, agenda item number 4, review and discuss proposed regulations for the retired status for a psychologist license. So, board members, committee members, I should say. Discuss here. What page is that on? Ms. Sorick?
Just to put this item in context, at the November board meeting, the board reviewed draft language for the establishment of a retired license status. At that time, a question was brought before staff to understand how an inactive status to a retired status would occur if the language moved forward as it was written. So the staff provided the attached language that you see in the committee materials to review to ensure that we could capture those inactive folks that are interested in a retired status. So that's why the language has been brought before the licensing committee, and then should the language change, it will be brought to the board at the February meeting.
Thank you. Thank you for that background information. Is there any discussion by the committee about this? So it looks like this is under section 1397.69. Highlighted there, right?
1381.
Oh, I'm reading one of my suggestions. Yes, it's under 1381 total, but 1381.10. But I think the particular section that clarifies it, right, is 1397.69. So there are a couple things I'd like to say. First of all, to call it a retired license, did we have discussion about whether this should be called a retired license or a retired status of a license? I think we had talked about that, license and retired status or something.
That's in the language for subsection A, is a licensed psychologist may apply for a license in retired status.
Right, I understand that. I'm talking about the title of this section. I don't know that we want to call it retired license if really what we're talking about is a retired status. So that's I guess the first thing, just right off the bat, but then I'd like us to talk about these changes that staff put in there. Are they clear? Do we understand what?
And we took the retired license language from the statute, and that was part of our sunset. So in 2988.5 of the Business and Professions Code, it does say retired license.
Okay. So would that be something maybe in an omnibus bill we would change the name of that, or does it matter? I don't want it to be confusing to folks. Well, if they're retired, if it's that status, it's not that they're, I mean, you know what I'm saying.
I think we have had some of those discussions, particularly to make it clear that it's not a license type. So, for example, someone cannot come in from out of the state and apply for that type of license.
Right.
But they'd be applying for a
Right.
license, and then it's the status of that license.
Right.
Whether or not it, 2988.5 could be, I don't know. You'd have to ask Mark about that.
Is it possible for us, Ms. Marks, to, as long as we're referring to the exact statute that involves the retired license, to actually call this retired status as a title?
Give the reg the title, any title you want. It's the authority that the statute gives you that you need to be mindful of in the language of the reg.
And I think we ought to call this section retired status. Okay? All righty. So let's take a look at 1397.69, continuing, it's under continuing professional development audit fee, but let's look at licensing, renewing in an active status or after inactive, comma, delinquent, or reactivating from a retired status. Is that clear to y'all? Is that clear? That's what we're talking about, right? These changes. Okay. Is this clear to folks? In addition to any other fees due to the board and as a condition of renewal or reinstatement, a $10 fee is to be paid to the board by a license renewing in an active status or after inactive, comma, delinquent, and I'd put comma there too, I know y'all don't do that, or reactivating from a retired status. Those fees are due. That seems clear. Okay.
Yes.
Seems clear to me. I think y'all did a good job in how you did that. We all agree it's clear. So is that do we have to move this and then have public comment? What do we have to do?
I think for clarification for staff, we just want to make sure that we are capturing those people that are on inactive status.
Right.
That would like to retire. So if we need to add in another subsection of the first part to include those folks, that way we can, if we could make a motion on all that language, including the inactive status folks that are interested in retired status.
Okay, and that is, where did you put that part? Okay.
So you're asking us to come up
You're
with
asking
additional
for
language.
permission to put that part in there. What?
I think for policy purposes, I want to make sure that the committee is okay with allowing people that have an inactive status to apply for retired status, and then we can come up with the language.
Yes, absolutely. So what we just changed here wasn't what y'all, that was just something I highlighted. For additional clarification.
There you go.
Okay, so we are actually voting on whether or not, aside from those changes that we made or agreed to, we're saying, is it okay? We're going to answer the question, is it okay? Do we think it's okay for people to move from inactive to apply for, who are now on inactive, who want to be have that retired status? Is that okay, and do we want that to be part of this?
I'd like
I
to
see
ask
no
a point.
reason.
I'd like to ask a point of clarification. In order to have an active status, you had sometimes had to have an active license, correct? And at some point, you determined that you wanted to go to inactive status, and you paid a smaller renewal fee biannually.
Yes.
So at some point, they were a licensed psychologist.
Right.
I don't have any problem with the idea then of them having the capacity to have a retired license or a retired status.
Clarification for the question of the inactive status incorporation, would that be included in a separate section in the proposed 1381.10, or would it be included in the section 1397.69? Where would the inclusion of the inactive provision be?
In the first section,
Understood.
point 10.
1.10. Yeah. So we're agreed, we think it's a good idea to allow this. Okay, that's where it would be. And so Do we wait another licensing committee for this to be brought back, or could you bring it back before the board? What?
One thing Marks had mentioned before, and I just want to make sure to clarify, in 1381.10, Section A, it mentions pursuant to Section 2988.5 of the code, a licensed psychologist may apply for a license in retired status. Now, a licensed psychologist could also include an inactive license. Is that correct?
I think it could, 2988.5, simply sub A, which gives you the authority to create this status, says a retired licensee, sort of midway through the first sentence, a retired license to, the board may issue a retired license to a psychologist who holds a current license issued by the board. Current could still be inactive. Have to renew an inactive license. So I think you have the authority to do that. And I didn't see in the code or in the reg the idea that the applicant must be current on their CE. You assume if they're in active status, they are. And in inactive status, there's probably a pretty good assumption that they're not, but I didn't see a requirement for that. So if the board is okay with someone shifting from the inactive to a retired status, knowing that they're not, that they are not current on their CE, then I would say we can just make that clear in the language, because if they do come inactive, they become restored to active status, they do have to become current on their CE, right?
Right.
So you would have that protection there. So I don't see it as a problem to make it clear that somebody can go from an inactive status to a retired status.
Because inactive is still a licensed psychologist.
Correct,
who
it's still,
is
and it's still
inactive.
current.
Mhm, it's still current, yeah. So,
They can't practice on an inactive
Right,
license,
right.
but it is considered current if they've paid their fees. That, is staff concur with that?
That's correct, because in Breeze it does say current inactive.
so we're all right. Nothing needs to be changed on Part A. That's okay.
I think the board just wants to you can either make it clear in how it's implemented, or if you want to add some language in there that this includes an inactive license. I'm not sure that you need to, because again, current still can be inactive.
Right.
And all that's required under 2988.5 is that the license is current, right? I'm not seeing anything that says that it has to be active.
What if we just use the language from the statute, which says, a licensee, a psychologist who holds a current license issued by the board may apply for a license instead of a licensed psychologist, because that might imply active more so than a psychologist who holds a current license.
That sounds good.
You can do that. It also clarifies that the license has to have been issued by the board, so that the board is not asked by people from out of state if they can come in and apply for a retired license, because the license initially has to be issued by.
Right.
I'm going to suggest maybe we want to be a little bit more explicit than that. Although I think it's a good change. I don't think somebody that has an inactive license necessarily thinks of their license, active license, or a current license. So I think we should be explicit as opposed to keeping with our philosophy that we're going to try to make the regulations much more user-friendly.
So it would be who holds a current license, including an inactive license.
Including an
active or inactive.
inactive license.
Got
yeah. That would probably do it.
Yeah. Active.
What
or
about
inactive.
a licensee who holds a current active or inactive license?
Good. That's good too.
Issued by the board.
Right.
Yeah. That's good.
That sounds good.
Okay, so again, I want to ask, can this come to the board in the changed form that we're talking about here? Or does it have to, because we're saying, yeah, we want,
I don't see a problem with that
Okay.
because
it's
The
the same
changes are-
agenda item, so.
the changes are fairly simple. Unless the committee wants to see the language again, you can simply say that this is the change you want to recommend to go to the board.
Those two changes then.
There are a couple sort of grammatical changes I might suggest at this point.
Yeah.
I think in sub B, I've just been playing around this now, say, start with to apply to restore the license to an active status if the license was in retired, if the license in retired status was issued less than 3 years prior, the licensee shall. Because I got a little bit lost when it says, if the license in retired status was issued less than
Yeah.
3 years prior to apply, to me, it was a little bit backwards. So I would just kind of flip those two phrases. Then the only other grammatical change I'd make is in B1. Just because this is the language that I like to use, I would say submit form PSY 905, which is hereby incorporated by reference, and then have a comma after reference.
If we're bringing this to the board in February, could I make the suggestion that the memo that goes with the language provide some sort of differentiation for not only the board members, but for the larger public about the different status? And because from my reading, the benefit of the retired status is that you don't have to renew biannually compared to the inactive status. And that's not immediately clear if you're doing a cursory reading from the 35,000-foot level versus where we are right now, which is deep in the weeds. And so for the benefit of the larger audience, when it does go to the board, I think it might be helpful to structure a conversation where this is what you get with an active status, this is what you get with an inactive status, and this is what you get with the retired status. Sort of like a Costco membership tier kind of deal. So,
But we're not promoting Costco.
no, sorry, that was by way of analogy for comprehension
Just teasing.
from the public member.
I think that's a good idea to have the memo be a little bit more explicit. That'll be helpful. Thank you.
The only other change, sort of grammatical change I would make in B1 that I was referring to is a comma after reference, and then I would probably say, and pay all the biannual renewal fees and all additional fees as prescribed in section with a small s. I think that's what our office likes. Section 2987 of the code, and then section 1397.69 rather than sections, because they are two different bodies of law.
That's good, thanks. And I also have just one little comma I want to add. Under 1397.69, for the administration of this article, in addition to any other fees due the board, comma, and as a condition of renewal or reinstatement, blah, blah, blah.
I think another question to explain in the memo or some sort is to put in context why the license has to come from the board in the first place in order to apply for a retired license. Because a reading of the statute dictates that they can use the title psychologist retired or retired psychologist, and of course they can't practice, etc. And so I think explaining why we wouldn't, for example, if you are from another state, but you've chosen to retire in California, but you do find a association with that title and in some way, even though you're not practicing, we have to explain why we're not going to grant them that ability to use that title still from another profession. So that might be something that we
Yeah,
differentiate.
I do think most people would understand that who are licensed psychologists. You know, you can't come here because you've never been licensed here and call yourself that, you know. So I do think people would understand that, but just kind of as a way of, I don't know, I don't think it'll hurt to say, or just to emphasize we're speaking about people that have been licensed by this board, period. Yeah. Okay. Any more from us? So we don't need a motion or anything, do we, for this? But just to say, we've agreed on this, we've changed the language, we'd like the changed language to come back to the board, or do we need to move it? Okay. So will somebody move that?
I move that we recommend to the board the adoption of the language of these sections as amended during our conversations today.
And second.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify, Dr. Phillips, the motion was to approve the language, to recommend to the board that this is the language that be noticed?
Yes. Yeah, that too.
And second.
Thank you. Can you second it? Okay. All right, can we have a roll call, please, on that motion? Oh, wait. Is there any public discussion? Ms. Winkleman? Sorry. Oh, I said Ms., and I'm sorry about that, too, Dr. Winkleman. I'm too flustered this morning. I need more coffee. There's a gray thing on the
Button on
side
the
of it.
side.
All right. Hi, this is Elizabeth Winkleman with the California Psychological Association. I just had one question. I think that the retired status is a really good move that this is being proposed and going to be enacted. My question is, it talks about what you can do to reactivate if you went into retired status within less than 3 years. But it doesn't talk about, well, what happens if it's been more than 3 years? And I think in the form that was given as an additional handout, it looked like maybe a person would have to completely reapply. And I'm just wondering about that because, for example, if you're in inactive status, you can be in inactive status for 20 years. And if circumstances change, you can reactivate. And I'm a little concerned that why would we then allow people only 3 years? It's possible someone's circumstances could change. For example, their spouse dies and they unexpectedly need to come out of retirement for financial reasons. And so that I'm wondering if the board can address this.
If I can, Dr. Winkleman, the short answer is it's in the code. 2988.5 D2, I believe, says where the applicant has a retired license for 3 or more years, the applicant shall do all of the following. As submit an application for a new license, take and pass the psychology, law, and ethics exam, pay all the fees to obtain a new license, comply with the fingerprint requirements, etc. It's in the code.
Okay,
That's
so
kind of the
if
short
that's
answer.
in the code, then my suggestion for the board's consideration would be either put something about that specifically in this section saying you cannot renew to active status, and then in line with Dr. Fu's suggestions, which I think are excellent in terms of FAQs and how we frame this, make sure that psychologists know that if they think there is any possibility that they may need to reopen practice, why they might want to choose inactive status as opposed to retired status, because a person could really, we would want people to be fully informed so they don't get stuck. No one's going to want to reapply when they're 75 years old to become licensed again after a whole career if they decide they need to practice again.
That's a really good idea. We could FAQs.
So question, are we doing a substitute motion to include that more than 3 years, or are we just including that in the FAQs?
Well, maybe it's something to talk about. but I don't know if it's something to talk, I mean,
Well,
I don't know. What do y'all think?
I think, right, for today, the agenda talks about the regulations. I think what Dr. Winkleman has brought up is a statutory change that addresses the requirements for returning to an active license after a period of certain years. So if you wanted to have that broader discussion, I think you'd have to have it noticed.
Agendized in,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, that sounds fine. So,
My personal opinion is this is what complies with the code section as it's written. I think it's pretty clear.
yeah,
If you go into retired status, it's less than 3 years you can apply to go back into active status so I don't know that there's anything we need to do here, but I do think it's a good idea on perhaps somewhere in the licensing materials online that we provide kind of definitions, working definitions, kind of operational definitions actually, of what all these categories are and what the advantages and disadvantages. Important thing. And to recognize that maybe you could go into inactive status, even though you feel like you're retiring, there's a possibility you might have to come back. You don't know when that would be, then you just go into inactive state. Defer going into retired status till later.
so for-
Yeah, in addition, that could be where the board points out that you can only do it twice, I think. So in those FAQs about what you might want to consider before you choose going into this status.
excellent. Thanks for that help there. And any other public comment on this issue, the retired status issue? All righty. Seeing none, take a vote on this.
Wu,
Aye.
Horn,
Aye.
Phillips.
I
Motion has passed.
All right. Next section. Section number 5, or agenda item number 5, inactive status for psychological assistance. All right, and that's page, if you've got the rolling agenda, combined agenda 41. So Ms. Chung, you want to tell us about this? Thanks.
Definitely, no problem. So this item, the committee has reviewed the proposed language come up with by staff in October last year. The committee agreed that they were not ready to move forward with the regulatory changes at that time, but have asked staff to provide statistics on extension request, and staff have provided that included in your materials in attachment A for the committees to review. So just a little bit background to recap regarding this proposed language. This is to implement part of our Sunset Bill, SB 1193. The board has begun the initial phase in promulgating regs to implement this bill, and then this draft proposal is to add language to allow the registered psychological assistant to play their registration on an inactive status. So the intent for having an inactive status for the psych assistant is to mainly enhance consumer protection just by clearly stating to the public that when they are not practicing while holding this status. Because right now, if a psychological assistant holding a current registration, they might be in a period, interim period looking for a supervisor or have to attend to certain personal matters, but their status is still showing current on the public license lookup. So when a public member goes look up their license online, it might it is still showing current status, so which might lead to confusion. So staff think that is maybe a benefit to the public and to the registrants to know that, okay, they have this inactive status available for them.
Okay, thank you. And y'all can see what the licensing staff sent to us about extension requests. and what the reasons are for doing that, or the reasons are for requesting that extra time. So I have a question. What additional I don't know what to say, responsibility or burden or whatever, does this place on staff and on psych assistants? I mean, I want to, from your point of view, how do you manage this? How do you,
For extension request?
I'm sorry?
For extension request or,
Yeah.
okay, so.
Well,
right-
for people wanting to put themselves on inactive status. Isn't that what
Oh.
you're talking about? Psych assistants inactive because, for some reason.
Right.
So it tolls the,
It stopped the
it
clock for the
stops the
72
clock,
months.
yeah, for their
So,
assistantship.
Yeah. So right now, because we don't have this status, that we cannot put them on inactive status, so we will advise them, okay, thanks for letting me know that you cannot practice right now. So we will advise them, you can either cancel your registration to stop the clock. So, but it will be entirely up to the registrant to make that decision and to let us know. So that would be
and
only
then what
way
does
for
it
them.
do for you? In terms of, then what do you do with it?
Oh, so we
If a psych assistant says, hey, I need to stop my registration because I don't have a supervisor right now and I got to find another supervisor, then what does it do for you? How do you note that? What happens,
Yes, so we would, administrative-wise, we would dissociate them with their supervisor that they terminated on the breeze. So in the on the public license lookup, then there will be no association with the supervisor anymore. So it will be just plainly their registration info that is regularly there. And then we'll advise them that you are still holding a registration, and then it won't stop the clock to us the 72 months. So you can let us know if you decide to cancel your registration for now, so then it will stop the clock officially. Otherwise, the time that they're on registration, even though they're not practicing, it will still count to us the clock right now.
Right, no, so I'm saying if they apply for inactive status, what does that do?
Okay, so if they apply for inactive status, then we will be able to stop the clock for them. And then on the public license lookup page, it will also show that very clearly that this registrant's inactive right now. And then we'll have a tooltip that says that they're not practicing. So it's very clear to have that distinction there.
Okay, and so for you, it's really a matter of informing,
The public.
I understand that, but I mean, informing the Breeze system, or you put it in the Breeze system, and it can happen pretty quickly.
Yes.
so,
It's the
okay.
moment that we approve the transaction, then it will be uploaded fairly quickly to the system
Okay.
on both our internal and the public side.
Great. And so then for the psych assistants, it's just a matter of sending an email or picking up the phone?
So
And-
that would be, I would suggest that if that's the direction that the committee decided to move forward, we should have regulatory language just to lay out clearly what happens, what they do to to get the inactive status, and what happened that they need to, what kind of steps that they need to do when they want to come back active.
Okay. So we haven't decided what the psych assistant does yet,
No.
is partly what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. Any questions about understanding this? Do y'all have, yeah, Mr. Fu?
So just for, again, context setting here. So I noticed from 2016 to 2017, there was a large increase in the receipt of extension requests. And the primary driver of that is the institution of the 72-month rule. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so following on Dr. Horn's questions, then this would allow for the various circumstances that we may see for why medical, etc., personal, it would allow that if this inactive status was to be put in place, it would allow someone to stop the clock on that 72-hour time period, resolve any issues, personal issues that they may be having, and then restart the clock so that they wouldn't have to come back to the board for an extension request. Is that correct?
Correct.
Dr. Phillips?
It's a good example of something we can do that'll be of benefit to the psychological assistants and will also be a benefit to the public, so that when these exceptional circumstances come up, the registrant can take time off from being a psychological assistant and not worry about the 6-year clock running, but also a better way of informing public, if they were to look, for instance, at our licensing page, that the person's not entitled to practice as a psychological assistant during that period of time. So I think it's great.
All right, so what do we need to do to say, go forward? Mr. Fu, yes.
Just another quick question. Again, the denied by staff statistic, I think there was 0 from last year and 31 in 2017. What was the primary driver, out of curiosity, for that, for the denials? Was it?
So if you look at, there's a pie chart on attachment A, extension request reasons. So, and the one that follows, the reason staff denied 72 months, that you can see that we denied those extension requests based on they have already fulfilled their capacity as a trainee, so they don't really need any more time to be on a trainee to gain more, to get their requirements towards licensure. So that would be the main difference.
And the goal of that is to move them forward into licensure, and so that we end this practice of continuing the psychological assistant to continue that practice.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you for the explanation.
All right, is there any public comment on this issue of allowing psych assistants, developing a process for psych assistants to go on inactive status that would stop the clock for certain circumstances? Any public comment on that? So seeing none, then what do we do?
On page 47 of the combined document, there's some draft regulatory language to establish the inactive psychological assistant registration.
Okay, so let me just ask a question, 1391.13, submitting the following, it's all 3 of these forms?
Correct.
And what if they're not removing a primary supervisor, but need to stop for medical reasons, and the primary supervisor, I mean, are they removing a primary supervisor, or this person, what happens? It's not because they're taking the supervisor away, it's because they have medical reasons or something. So then what happens?
That's a good question. And then in those cases right now, we don't know about those. So it will be whatever the committee thinks that it is appropriate for them to do, and then we can craft language to accommodate that. Thoughts?
Well, it seems kind of unwieldy to me if you have a primary supervisor who's interested in working with you when you come back again, to actually remove that supervisor and then have to add the supervisor back in. It's inefficient from our point of view. I think it's also inefficient from the point of view of the psychological assistant. So I would suggest that 3, subitem 3 not be included in subsection A.
I mean, I would agree with you. I don't, so what we're saying is if you want to be inactive, you submit Form 200, which is your, what?
So that form, we will be crafting that. So it would just, this is just our plan that we should have some form of application to notify us in writing and to document the process.
So you're going to create this form that says, I want to do this, and then the annual report. And the annual report is already required for anyone. And if they haven't been a psych assistant for long enough to have an annual report, or do they, what are we wanting? What if 6 months into the psych assistantship, this person has a medical problem? So then what?
So the purpose of the annual report right now is to, for the psych assistant and the supervisor to let us know that their performance meet their standard. So it would be up to the committee to decide if we will also want to require this form upon separation for this purpose.
Okay, so as I'm reading this, there are 2 things here that we don't agree with. And so I think maybe what we should do is talk about what we do want there and what we don't want there, and not approve this for going forward till it's changed. Now, maybe we can change it prior to the board meeting, or it goes to the next board meeting. I'm asking y'all what you...
I have a question that's related to what the question you're posing us, but it's a clarification, I think, related to the discussion of A3, which is the form PSB 101.
Right.
And so is the intent of that form so that the psychologist overseeing the psychological assistant doesn't max out on their 3? Because I think there's a requirement that they see no more than 3, they don't supervise more than 3 psych assistants. And so is the intent there so that when a psychological assistant decides to go into an inactive status, the supervising psychologist can then lower their count, if you will, so they can take on additional psychological assistants so they don't max out on their 3? So is that potentially why we've included that language there to ask them to remove their primary supervisor?
I don't know why they included that there, but I don't think that should be here. I don't think this is for the supervisor. I think that's something separate. So if the supervisor says, hey, I've got somebody on inactive status, maybe that's something else we have to determine. That's my own thinking about it, because I think this is really for the psych assistant, and that's how we have to look at this. But you raise a good point, Yeah,
I think it's an interesting question, because if you had 3 psychological assistants and one of them became inactive, does that count against your limit of 3 psychological assistants? I don't think most of us run into this dilemma of having but sometimes in institutional settings or in clinics is an important consideration. But you could always put in the form to office to supervisor to be removed.
Right.
Independent of this process of becoming inactive or inactive. So I think rather than have it in here, which to me is a little confusing, actually think, is there a reason you feel like the language needs substantial reworking, Dr. Horn?
Well, I don't know what I think we ought to include here under A. I don't think we should include 3, and I'm not sure we should include 2. I mean, maybe for 2, we don't want to say annual report. We want to say a report from the supervisor saying this person is in good standing, but, it's not the annual report. But definitely, we don't want number 3. but we may want something else. Or maybe not, because maybe all the person has to do is submit the form that says, I want to go inactive, and we get a report that just says this person is in good standing and isn't going inactive because the person really isn't good, or something like that, right? So maybe that's all we need. And then the other thing, in Part B now, we're saying that annually the psych assistant has to renew the status. Do you want that? I mean, I think we have to think of this a little bit more. It may be a little bit more than we're ready to.
I see what you're saying.
Thing. We're in agreement, we like the inactive status, but I think the regulation isn't quite there yet, is my thinking. And I mean, we can look at it and think, take a look at each part and think about the impact of that. Somebody is, and I keep thinking of medical reasons, because we do get those. If they're extensive, I don't know they're going to be thinking about renewing their inactive every year if they're dealing with some of the,
Although I do think there's an advantage to people having to keep in mind that they are in a particular status, that they do have an ongoing obligation to the board to inform us of when they want to go off the status. Rather than having it just kind of fade off into obscurity, it's kind of an open-ended thing. Somebody goes on inactive status and 15 years later, they want to go back to accumulating hours, which obviously is not going to work for a variety of different reasons.
Right.
But I think there should be some kind of annual document or acknowledgement we receive from them personally. Just that we
but
know
is
that
that
they're
something
still.
maybe we initiate? I think we need to think about this, or we can talk, we're obviously talking about it now, we can talk about it now, but,
Just out of curiosity, what was the reasoning for the 1-year renewal requirement versus another time period, if you will? So, for example, an inactive license for a psychologist is a biannual renewal. This is an annual renewal. So, what is the thinking behind an annual versus a biannual for psychological assistants?
So psychological assistants currently they have to renew annually, so we're just keeping the same period.
So if that's the reasoning behind that, for me, the annual renewal makes sense to keep in line with the rest of the process. And to Dr. Phillips' comment about keeping it omnipresent, so that moving forward, they remember the requirements to the board. But I am curious, Dr. Horn, in terms of how we then choose to move this forward. What policy direction then are we providing to the staff so we can continue to have this conversation?
well, that's what I'm trying to determine right now. I mean, if we can come to an agreement about what needs changing here, then let's ask the changes be made and it be brought to the board in changed form.
I actually think probably this needs to be thought about a little bit more. For instance, are we putting a time limitation on how much time? Can somebody take years and years off and then go back for 6 months and take years?
We're not going to.
I don't think that's what we want. So I think there needs to be also a time element indicated in here. And I don't know what the optimal time element might be.
So maybe, yeah, I do think we need to think about it more, because if, like we say, every year you have to renew this, maybe it gets reevaluated every year. So I think those are the kinds of things we probably want to
Be addressed in the regs. Is that sufficient? Is that sufficient direction for staff? I have the feeling we're having this vague conversation and saying, yeah, bring us something different.
So far I've got like the feedback kind of what they submit, and then you have agreed that you guys the committee would like to see the form for sure, but not quite sure on the report, or maybe not the annual report, but some kind of reporting materials. And as to what is on.
I think we're sure on that, too.
Okay,
We do
great.
want there to be some, not the annual report necessarily, but a report that says this person is in good standing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can work on that, no problem. And then regarding the removal of supervisors, that the committee have different opinions on that? Do we want to have that?
I think the primary sentiment was that they don't need to remove a supervisor in order
Okay.
to go in inactive status.
Okay, so yeah, we can make that change. And then the committee will also want to see like a time elements in the language. And then from my memory, if I recall correctly, from the last meeting, I think the committee has suggested like a 2-year time limitation for them to be on inactive status. Would you like staff to incorporate that time elements into the regulatory draft, or it would just leave it open?
If we determine that, I think it should be in our regulation. Yeah,
I am curious to that. Sorry, Dr. Phillips.
without coming back to us. Yeah.
I am curious in terms of the cases that you review and oversee, what is the average time off? Because I think a 2-year may make sense in alignment with what's existing, but I wonder if that accurately reflects the existing circumstances of the folks who are requesting the extension currently. So it may be 2 years, maybe 1, or maybe even longer. And if it is longer, I think then it's our prerogative to have that discussion of what makes sense. But I would be curious to understand what is the average time off folks are requiring for the various reasons and average that out.
Okay.
If that's easy to do. If it's not, then never mind. But if it's something that you can pull from data fairly efficiently and not have to crunch numbers on paper, then yeah.
Yeah, staff would definitely take a look at that. That's a great idea.
And I think we want to think about whether we want to have a time limitation cumulatively. I mean, can somebody do a total of 4 years of inactive status at any point in time? Plus, do we want to put a time limit on any particular inactive status? So it's the cumulative and the individual. So you guys don't necessarily need to determine, obviously the committee's going to need to determine what those lengths of time are going to be, but you could at least draft the language so we can take a look at it. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
And bring it back to our next licensing committee meeting then.
in April.
Okay, because we're not really, I think, quite ready to move forward on this.
I would also suggest that the committee and the staff think about a couple logistical things. One is whether or not you are actually going to end up spending more time, because if for some reason one of the psych assistant loses a supervisor, so quick hits the pause button, and then because he or she doesn't know when they'll get a new supervisor, and then they get a new supervisor 3 weeks later, then you unpause it. You've kind of created a lot of work for yourselves. The other issue would be how difficult are you making it to calculate that 72 months? Well, do you add 3 weeks here when they were paused, and then another 2 weeks over there when they paused, another, a year down the road, et cetera. The other, I think, more policy issue to consider is how this will affect your decision-making with respect to your ability to, and your obligation to review requests for extensions of time. If someone were to say, well, I have to justify my extension of time, but if I had been able to hit the pause button, we wouldn't even be here. And do you create potentially inequalities because somebody hit the pause button and somebody else did not? So I think there's a logistical, and I think there's a policy issue that may complicate the matter. There's also a potential that as we get farther down the road to the time in which the 72 months has become effective and has really started to hit people, whether those requests aren't going to drop off right now, I think you're probably seeing maybe the height of them, and I'm not sure because I don't think we have enough history there, but are you not sort of seeing the height of them? And now, as people understand the 72 months is going to impact them, that they are a little bit more cognizant of that time and getting their supervised experience in that period of time. And if those requests drop off, then is this creating a solution for which there isn't a big problem?
You know, I think that's very helpful. I want to thank you for putting that there, because this has been a high period. October of 2017 was the 72-month, the end of the 72-month extension for people who are already psych assistants. And this actually may be less of an issue or less of a problem as we extend on out, because we've had definitely more requests for extension than we've ever had in these last few months, and you know, just in the years I've been on the board. So what do you suggest we do about that? Should we wait a little while, or should we just say we'd like to see these changes? I'm asking you, Ms. Mark. We'd like to see these changes, and that would come back to the licensing committee the next time, and maybe that's when we make a decision about it?
Well, I think the board needs to determine how important the policy is. The committee has to determine how important the policy is that they want to recommend to the board. If you think it's important, an important protection for psych assistants, but you still want some historical perspective on it, you can sort of ask the staff to report back in again at the next committee meeting. It's really up to you. I just wanted you to think about some of those issues, and staff as well, because I'm not sure how you would end up calculating those pauses. Is it a month's worth, and that extends the 72 months one more month? How are you going to do it? And I just don't want to create more problems than you're solving. So if you think it's an important, I guess, protection, for lack of a better word, for the psych assistants, but you want some more history on it, you can ask the board staff to report back on the numbers of extensions. And even if they're not dropping off, if they're not increasing, talk about what the workload is to kind of hit the pause button, off and on for registrants, how you would calculate that and kind of come back and answer those questions.
Mr. Fu?
I'm following on Ms. Mark's questions and considerations. I'm curious to know if other states have an inactive status for psychological assistance, in terms of, or a parallel structure that might help guide this discussion and Ms. Mark's considerations. And then I see my colleague shaking heads no. So that means never mind.
Other
we don't
states don't necessarily even have psych
That's true.
assistants, so it's a different kind of a, yeah.
Okay, so never mind. That's done.
Good question, though, I think.
Hold on. So to the question about the October 2017 being sort of that mark that resulted in the surge, if you will, for extension requests, and is this a solution in search of a problem kind of perspective? I would be curious, just prior to the institution of that 72-month rule, how many times psychological assistants were renewing their application, renewing their status prior to the 72-month rule?
Well, everybody had to renew it every year.
Right, before they were canceled or expired. Okay,
Right.
got it. I understand what I'm.
Particularly now that we've changed the structure so they can have changed supervisors, their registration is going to start at date X and last for, without a pause button, 6 years or an extension. The thing I like about this actually is that it puts a little bit more control in the hands of the registrant, but it also gives us more information. So I do like the idea of it. I do think that if staff's going to bring back a proposed regulation, it should have an element that indicates how time's going to be computed. Or at least you'd have to propose to us how you would internally want to compute that. I think we should continue to work on the regulation personally. We know the regulations are not necessarily implemented all that quickly, so I have the feeling that the bubble of extension requests is probably going to go on pass by the time any regulation would be implemented. But I do like the idea of this because I think it gives a little bit more control to the psychological assistant so that when they're having adverse circumstances, they lose their supervisor, something like that, they're able to put things on pause until they can get things sorted out, or if they're having a major medical issue until the medical issue resolves. Or it seems like the common things that we see are major medical issues and illness or death of family members. So I would very much like to see us provide some kind of mechanism because I think it's...
And maybe this would be done, I'm not sure, so we're going to continue to look at it, but maybe this would be done by a simple matter of sending an email to the licensing staff and saying this is going on and I'd like to pause it instead of making it more cumbersome or something. But we clearly still want to think about this issue. So if you could come back maybe next time with some of the things that we've asked for, not only in the change of regulations, but what's going on in terms of these requests and what they're for.
So do you have any questions?
Oh, sorry. I think we have got a pretty good idea of what the committee is asking. So we'll provide some information and probably some language for the committee to consider at our next meeting.
Okay, and if you have any questions, you can ask us, like, is this what you wanted?
Yeah, no problem. We'll definitely do that.
All right, so we are through on this agenda item. At this point, staff is going to come back with some suggested language and some more information for us about what's going on in those requests. All right, we're about to hit the examination subject matter, examination information. I'm wondering if we should take a 10-minute break and we'll come back and start. I'm sorry. Oh, there was public comment? Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Public comment on item number 5, inactive status for psych assistants. Dr. Winkleman.
Hi, Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman again with California Psychological Association. I think there are a number of good ways to handle the psychological assistance, and possibly the inactive status might be a good way. I wanted to just bring one other consideration that you've kind of touched on, but up for consideration is I think you're also considering later in the meeting reducing the number of months that a person can be a psychological assistant to 60 instead of 72. If I'm not mistaken. I think I saw that in the proposals. In any case, it may be worth considering just extending the period, or at least not shortening it, and it may be unnecessary. I mean, another way to do it is just to make the period that a person could be a psychological assistant a little bit longer, so it's not an indefinite period that somebody can't just spend their whole career like that, but making it a little bit longer, it might be easier for the psych assistants and for the staff to just, have the requests for extensions be a little more of an exceptional case, and then people could apply for an extension if they needed it, but just give people ample time. So if they did have a medical issue, if their supervisor had a medical issue, if they had various things, they could still complete it within that period of 72 months or maybe even longer, and then have people apply for an extension. Anyway, just an idea that I thought would be worth considering, because I think those two things really relate to each other, the total amount of time and the potential need for hitting the pause button.
Thanks very much for that comment.
I did just want to say that, and this is very brief, I did want to say that the reason we have a time limitation is we do want people to get their training done in a certain amount of time from when they began graduate school till the end. Otherwise, you have kind of a diffuse period in which you're not sure how current their knowledge stays. Certainly, there are licensing exams that they have to take, but we'd like to do it in a relatively concerted fashion, being reasonable about the amount of time that we provide people to do it. So a lot of the extension requests we run into are with people that start their psych assistantships after they've completed their master's, but before they've completed their doctorate. And then situations sometimes, or it seems like recently that's
They
been
may
the
not
case.
complete their doctorate, or they may not pass the licensing exam. So, and the original 72 months, and let me just say, was, we took a look at how long it typically took people to get through graduate school, their graduate school program. And I think what you're talking about now, and that we'll address later, is about all the time we give in any setting. I think it's about trying to make things more consistent from one setting to the next or one title to the next. So, but we will take a look at that and take that comment into consideration. Thanks. Okay, now we'll take a break. 10 minutes.